Well, hello. This is lecture 8 of our series on pre-global Buddhism and its history. This lecture will cover, once again, some of the philosophical trends that were taking place within the great circle of Buddhism. In the previous lecture, lecture 7, I went through one of the streams of philosophical discourse, starting with the famous Nagarjuna, following up his disciple Aryadeva, a later supporter, Buddhapalita. Then we went on to Baba Viveka, and finally to Chandrakirti. That was one stream. In this lecture, I'm going to cover another stream. I'm just going to do 2 streams for the time being. And I hope that you can take time to follow up on all of these names, find out more about them. Because if you can follow these 2 streams of philosophical discourse, you really have a major part of the philosophical history and development of Buddhism in India. It is complex. They were doing some very subtle debates. And so it's very important, if you want to have built into your memory some kind of structure of how the philosophical discourse was taking place. So I'm suggesting to you by these 2 lectures that you can take what I call streams of discourse. And these streams of discourse imply that we can follow the arguments from one of the philosophers to the next. If you're finding it difficult somehow to conceive of this, you might try something which has become very current and is causing lots of anguish in some quarters, and that is the whole concept of blockchain. That a blockchain means a chain of interconnectedness in which you must maintain key issues of what the previous action was. This is used in business. In order to make sure that you can't cheat on the internet, in the blockchain, each activity has to be recorded, has to carry the information from the previous chain into this one, and it will be then carried on into future chains. So in a way, that's what's happening with the discourse. One philosopher starts the argument. Some centuries later, maybe, another person picks up on their argument, either in support or in disagreement. But they are, the new person who's dealing with it has to go back and brain up all the issues which were present in the previous exchange or words. This says you don't have in philosophical discourse, you don't have something which is totally new, which just breaks all the rules, which has no tie to what went on before it. Because everything is tied to what goes on before. This is true for our personal lives. We are what we are at this moment, but this moment is a reproduction of issues which were present before this moment. This body will pass along this data and information to another block. So the discourse, you must try to see the ways in which it interconnects and to understand that if we are trying to see the Buddhist tradition in the Great Circle, philosophically, commercially, pilgrimage, dissemination, any of the activities in the Great Circle, that we, as much as possible with events, need to say which event followed what event followed which one. And if we can put a time stamp on them and say this was 4th century, this was 6th century, this was 7th century, then we have some hope having a hold on how to study Buddhism in the pre-global period in the Great Circle. So let's take up this discourse that we're going to discuss in this lecture. We start in the 4th century. A discourse was begun by 2 brothers, Asanga and Vasubandhu. The story is that Asanga was a recluse. He was a meditator. He went off to caves and into the forests to meditate. And while he was meditating in the forest, it is said that Maitreya Bodhisattva came to him and taught him, and that he had direct contact with the future Buddha, Maitreya. So he was a very highly developed meditational adept. He became concerned because his brother, Vasubandhu, was very deeply involved with Abhidharma, and he was dealing with materiality in a way that Asanga said to him, thought, my poor brother, he needs to wake up to the fact of Mahayana. And I need to go to him and teach him, because I've been taught by Maitreya, and I need to make my brother Vasubandhu understand. So Vasubandhu, who had written the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya, the commentary to the Abhidharma Kosha, a great work on Buddhist thought, but not dealing with the Mahayana tradition, was taught by his brother Asanga the Mahayana Samgraha. That is, the Mahayana teaching, particularly the Mahayana teaching first of Nagarjuna, and then second, because Asanga was such a great adept at meditation, the Yogacara Bhumi, that is the yogic trance meditational state levels that he had achieved, And he converted his brother Vasubandhu, we're told. Now, if you're building a blockchain of how things get transmitted, you should know that so many things are attributed to Vasubandhu that seem to be in absolute opposites, that people have said, beware when you talk about Vasubandhu, because there were probably two people who had the same name. It was a name which people used, so that one Vasubandhu is not another in terms of what they taught or what they believed. So not every Vasubandhu that you read about was the brother of Sangha, in other words. But the discourse which these two began was to continue the work of Nagarjuna and the Madhyamika, the idea that nothing has essence, everything is without it. And so that discourse of Nagarjuna took two turns, one through his disciple Aryadeva, but now we can watch that discourse as it was interpreted through Asanga and Vasubandhu. The next block that we pick up is Dignaga. We've skipped some centuries, but finally in the 5th century arose another great Buddhist teacher who was a logician. Yes, the Buddhists had logicians. And Dignaga was the foremost of those who were in the area of logic. But he was also a great practitioner. He also talked about the deep states that he achieved. He was not moving strictly away from what we find with the issues of Asanga and Vasubandhu. So what was it that the tradition now teaches when we come to Dignaga? One of the main issues was characteristics. That is, what kind of characteristics are there? One of them is Svalakshana. That means those a characteristic which belongs strictly to one aspect or one person or one entity. And Samanya Lakshana is a characteristic which is shared by many. So I can say that I have a Svalakshana with a big nose, a beard, that are particular to me. Nobody has exactly the same kind that I have. On the other hand, many people have beards, many people have noses. So I both have Svalakshana, my own characteristics, but those characteristics at another level are shared with many other people. So Dignaga was faced with, what do you do with characteristics that have both a particular occurrence and those which just occur generally among many people? the problem was that this was to concern the Buddhist philosophers for many centuries, and probably still does. They're still trying to sort this out. Tignaga taught pramana, that's valid means of knowledge. How do you know that something is true? How do you know that something is valid? How do we gain knowledge? How does it come about? Well, Dignaga said there are two valid means of knowledge. One of them is just the spark of perception that occurs 1,000,000 times a day to us. That is when the light reflects off my computer screen and hits my eye and goes back and takes the impulse to my brain. That first impulse is enough to teach us. It's a valid means of knowledge. It only lasts for just a fraction of a second, but we get it. So today in cognitive science, they have proved that the brain only needs just a tiny little flash, and it can operate from there. That's why I recently gave a talk on everyday Buddhism and told a story about my going to a physical therapist and trying to develop my balance. And when I was in the physical therapist's office trying to balance, and I'm standing there on a rubber pad that's soft, and I begin to weave, and I have to grab this bar because it feels like I'm going to fall over. The therapist said to me, "Stop thinking. You cannot think balance. Your brain will do it for you if you will just let yourself wobble. It'll learn how to give you balance." That's pratyaksha. That is just the moment when the brain gets an impulse from my body that it's moving to the right, then the brain can immediately deal with it. As the therapist said to me, if you wait until you think my body is moving to the left and I better stop it and make it come back to the center so I won't fall over, if you wait until you can think all of that, you're on the ground. You've already fallen. So pratyaksha is a very important part of information in current thinking about perception. So almost 2,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago at least, Dignaga had spotted that. It's very interesting. He knew that a single flash of experience is enough to give us information. Now, he then said, there is another source of knowledge, and that is inference. Inference is when I have this flash, I take that information and I process it and I think about it and I give it a name and I can construct a theory and talk about it and look at its characteristics. I can make inference. I can make knowledge from just a little bit of a blink of an eye. But my anumana can go on, my argumentations can go on forever, almost like lectures, right? So this was Dignaga's attempt to continue to deal with what Nagarjuna had talked about, except he's trying to take it into a more logical domain. And even, even in the area of pratyaksha, he said there is a yogic pratyaksha. And a yogic one means when I'm in deep in meditative trance state, whatever flash of perception occurs in that state becomes a valid means of knowledge. And so when I come out of my trance state and out of my meditative state, I have learned something. I have acquired knowledge. And I think about that knowledge and I expand upon it. Now we move forward another 2 centuries. We have another block. Our blockchain now extends to a 7th century philosopher, Dharmakirti. Dharmakirti commented on Dignaga's work. Dharmakirti has one very interesting text where he says, how can we logically get the knowledge that there is something out there that we may not have a direct perception of, but through inference, we can assume is there. And so he said, one of the ways that you can do this is, you know that there are at times obstructions or pressures or urgings or pushes that do not seem to arise within oneself, but come from outside. He used this to say, this is proof of other minds. There are other minds out there, he said, other than ours. And we are coming in contact with those other minds. But nevertheless, he said there are no external objects that we can cling onto. Everything we know turns out to be internal. Even knowing the proof of other minds, the knowledge of that is internal. So everything that's known is mere data. Vijnapti matra. It is matra only, vijnapti, data. I'm using current terms here. So Dharmakirti was really setting the place for the mind-only doctrine. That whatever else is happening, the knowledge which we acquire is internal to us. Now, I believe this. That's why I told you at the beginning of the class, I realize I can't transfer knowledge to you. I can say some words, but what has to happen is internal to you as it is to me. Everything that I know and learn is internal to me. Ultimately, it is internal. It is how we live in the world where we get it indirectly We don't have fire in our brain, but we have some data. And the data says fire is hot and fire can burn. That's internal data, but it helps me live my external life. Now, for a while, we've had a big challenge to some of this because we had the idea for a while of quantum leap. And quantum leap said, strangely enough, that at the quantum level, things can exist in two different places at the same time. And this, they said, had been observed. If things can be in two different places at the same time, then the whole idea of characteristics that are in general and are personal to us is under attack. It would be hard to deal with if you can say things can be here and they can be there at the same moment. But there were some physicists who said this cannot be true. This just can't be true. This would violate every rule that we know. Well, just last year, for the first time, a group of scientists said, we now have photographed a quantum leap, photographed it. We have photographed the photon leaping from one point to another. And it is what we have always thought, a gradual process. The quantum leap is not that things exist in two different places at the same moment. It is not simultaneous. It's just very rapid. And it's so rapid that it looks like the thing is in two places at once. So I'm kind of glad to see that science is now coming back to the fact that we have rapid, gradual process. We move from A to B, and there is movement. Because they've discovered and photographed this, they now can predict when when there's going to be a leap of photons, and they can catch them in flight and reverse them and send them back where they came from. So the data is piling up to say that the old idea that things can be in two different places simultaneously is not true. Now we come to the last big block in this particular stream of teaching that I've been talking about. One of the great Buddhist teachers is Shantarakshita, 8th century. He did a very famous commentary to the work of Nagarjuna, the Madhyamika Alamkara. And he had some very famous disciples, Kamalashila, Haribhadra. He was perhaps the great final step in this particular lineage of thought that I've been describing. It was he who finally tried to synthesize all the kinds of arguments that were taking place in the Buddhist dialogues. The many streams of thought. So it's like someone who looks and sees the delta of a river. And they see at the delta that the river has split into 30 or 40 channels before it hits the sea. But if you reverse the process and look upstream, then finally you come to the place where while those have split off, in fact, you can see that they have come from the same source. That's what Shantarakshita did. And he helped synthesize Yogacara and Madhyamika. So the Madhyamika and the Yogacara traditions were, in his view, within the same basic Buddhist tradition. And he was famous because he's said to be the one who took this to Tibet at an early stage and founded the monastery at Samye, the first Buddhist monastery in Tibet. Of course, going back that far and being able to absolutely verify all the lore, as we know, quite difficult. But nevertheless, when we look at Samye, it's not just the first monastery in the Tibetan sphere, if it was, but it's also a symbol for what Santarakshita was trying to say. And he was trying to say these block links, which I have been able to look back and discuss, they have carried the same message. And if they're valid and if it works, then the Buddhist tradition is still expressed in whatever these streams that break off at the delta. It's like the Ganges River doesn't stop and disappear when it breaks into two streams just before it enters the sea. It's the Ganges River. The Buddhist streams of thought, he said, were like this. And so he was able to try to bring a degree of interpretation into Buddhism that would keep it from being seen as splitting off into distinct and very different types of sectarian development. He was trying to hold on to a single Buddhist tradition that's carried on with multiple conversations, multiple streams of thought. But in his view, it has always remained Buddhism. So when you look at what we're talking about in the course, the great circle of Buddhism, with all its varieties, with all its different issues over the centuries and in different places, in a way, Santarakshita gives us a hint that there is a way to look at all the vast differences and at the same time begin to see them as remaining within the tradition, so that a Madhyamika is a Buddhist, a Yogacara is a Buddhist, a Theravadan is a Buddhist, a Mahayanist is a Buddhist. That's what this stream of thought was trying to hold on to as the dialogue and the divisions in India multiplied. Thank you very much.